people think their home security cameras are there to catch porch pirates or trespassers. But in Ray Township, Michigan, one camera captured something much darker. It wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a crime of obsession. The grainy audio doesn't just record footsteps, it records the final, frantic moments of a marriage that ended in a hail of bullets. This is the story of Matthew Mollicone, a man who went looking for the truth with a loaded gun, and the camera that watched as his entire world collapsed in a stranger's driveway.
Ray Township, Michigan, a place where the American dream usually goes to retire. It's a township defined by its vast green spaces, quiet cul-de-sacs, and a sense of safety that most people pay a premium for. But safety is an illusion that can be shattered in a single heartbeat. On July 12th, 2022, the sun set over Michigan just like any other day. The temperature was humid, the air still. Most families were settling in, perhaps watching the evening news or finishing dinner. But inside one particular household, a different kind of heat was rising. Meet Matthew Louis Mollicone, 46 years old, a man who, until this very night, was just another face in the crowd. A husband, a father, a provider. But according to investigators, Matthew had spent the last few weeks living in a mental prison. A prison built of suspicion and jealousy. He was convinced that his wife of many years, 49-year-old Kimberly Ann Mollicone, was betraying him. He suspected an affair, not just with anyone, but with a man who lived only a short drive away. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It had become a cancer, eating away at his rational mind until only one thing remained: the need for a confrontation. Now imagine the car ride, a 20-minute drive that would change everything forever. Matthew is behind the wheel. His knuckles are likely white from gripping the steering wheel. Next to him sits Kimberly. What were they saying? Was there a final argument? Or was the silence inside that car more deafening than any shout? Matthew wasn't driving to talk. He had prepared for a war. In his possession was a firearm, a tool he believed would give him the upper hand in a situation he could no longer control. As they turned onto that secluded street in Ray Township at 9:30 p.m., the stage was set for a tragedy that no one, not even Matthew, could have fully predicted. The moment the car stopped, the clock began to accelerate. Matthew stepped out into the humid night air. He didn't hesitate. He headed straight for the garage area of the target house. He was looking for the man he believed had stolen his life. The confrontation was instantaneous. No warnings, no mediation, just raw, unfiltered rage. But Matthew had made a fatal assumption. He thought he would be the only one with a gun. He was wrong. The other man, sensing the threat, was also armed. Within seconds, this quiet Michigan garage was transformed into a kill zone. Imagine the terror of the people inside that home. Children and family members, completely innocent, suddenly found themselves in the middle of a literal shootout. They dove under tables, shielded their faces as lead bullets tore through the drywall, shattering the peace of their sanctuary. The other man was hit. A bullet tore through his leg, sending him to the ground in a pool of blood. But the exchange was far from over. As the chaos peaked, Matthew and Kimberly realized they were in over their heads. They turned to run. They scrambled back toward their car, desperate to put distance between themselves and the violence they had ignited. But in a gunfight, the darkness is your worst enemy. A stray bullet, fired in the heat of the moment, traveled through the air with a grim destiny. It didn't hit the house. It didn't hit a tree. It struck Kimberly Ann Mollicone directly in the neck. She collapsed on the pavement. The driveway, which should have been a place of retreat, became her final resting place. The man who came here to save his marriage was now kneeling over his dying wife. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow realization. He grabbed his phone. His voice, once full of bravado, was now a fractured mess of panic. By the time the Macomb County Sheriff's deputies arrived, the night was lit up with the strobe-like flashes of red and blue. They found a battlefield. Shell casings littered the ground like metallic rain. One man was clutching a shattered leg, and a woman, a mother of two, was motionless. The confrontation was over, but for Matthew Mollicone, the true nightmare, the legal, psychological, and personal reckoning was only just beginning. Macomb County detectives weren't just looking at a shooting. They were looking at a complex web of domestic turmoil. They quickly discovered that this wasn't a random act of violence. It was a targeted confrontation. Matthew Mollicone wasn't just a victim of a shootout. In the eyes of the law, he was the primary aggressor. As detectives began to piece together the timeline, the forensic evidence started to tell a story that Matthew hadn't anticipated. The sheer number of shell casings on the ground suggested a prolonged exchange of fire, not a single impulsive shot. The investigators scrutinized the ballistic reports, trying to determine whose bullet had actually taken Kimberly's life. But legally, in the state of Michigan, if you initiate a situation that leads to a death, the weight of that soul falls on your shoulders. By the time the charges were officially filed, the community was in shock. Matthew was hit with a barrage of counts: voluntary manslaughter, assault with intent to murder, and multiple felony firearm charges. The legal system was sending a clear message. Taking a gun to a personal dispute is a recipe for catastrophe. Fast forward to May 2024. The courtroom was packed. The air was heavy with the presence of family members from both sides, people who had lost a daughter, a sister, and a mother. Matthew sat at the defense table, his expression often unreadable, as the prosecution began to dismantle his life piece by piece. The prosecution's strategy was focused on one central theme: choice. They argued that every step Matthew took that night was a choice. Choosing to believe the rumors of an affair was a choice. Choosing to load his weapon was a choice. And choosing to drive to that house with his wife in the passenger seat was the ultimate choice that sealed Kimberly's fate. They played the 911 calls. The sound of Matthew's panicked voice filled the room. But the prosecutors argued that this wasn't the voice of an innocent man. It was the voice of a man realizing the consequences of his own ego. When it was the defense's turn, they painted a different picture. They spoke of a man pushed to the edge by betrayal. They claimed self-defense, arguing that the other man had fired first and that Matthew was merely trying to protect himself and his wife. They tried to portray him as a victim of circumstance, caught in a deadly crossfire he never intended to start. But the jury saw through the narrative of self-defense. They focused on the fact that Matthew had traveled to the location. He had sought out the conflict. Under the law, you cannot claim self-defense in a situation that you yourself provoked with lethal intent. After days of testimony and hours of grueling deliberation, the jury returned. The verdict was a crushing blow to Matthew. Guilty on all major counts. The final chapter of this tragedy unfolded in July 2024 at the sentencing hearing. The judge didn't hold back. Looking at Matthew, the court spoke of the senselessness of the act, how a domestic issue that could have been resolved through conversation or divorce had instead ended in a graveyard. Matthew Mollicone was sentenced to 86 months to 15 years for the manslaughter of his wife. But the heavier blow came from the assault charges, an additional 12 to 40 years in prison. When you add the mandatory 2-year enhancements for the use of a firearm, the reality becomes clear. Matthew, now in his late 40s, is looking at a future behind bars well into his elderly years. This case leaves us with a haunting reflection. It's a story about the thin line between love and possession, and how quickly jealousy can turn into a death sentence. Kimberly Mollicone is gone. Her children are left without a mother, and their father is a man the state considers a violent felon. In the end, the quiet streets of Ray Township have returned to their usual silence. But for the families involved, that silence will always be filled with the echo of those final fatal gunshots on a humid July night.